All right. So building a network security policy is one of the crucial roles of any network admin. And of course, if you want to reinforce security within a particular network, then you need to have some proper policy. So we are going to look at maybe some steps or just to identify or procedures of how you can implement a network security policy. Now, you should understand that a policy not only is it implemented in a network setup, but any environment, we normally have a policy. Now, there are a lot of, or the kind of advantages of having a policy that you're going to look at, right? Because this is a very vital document, because it's part and parcel of how you can implement network security. So these are some kind of well-defined guidelines or procedures on how the company needs to protect all the resources within a particular network, right? So it actually clearly defines all the rules, the procedures. Because when you talk about a network security, it really kind of associates or we associate different resources. It could be the users, it could be the devices. All the procedures need to be documented, that is, so that if something happens, right, things such as incidents response plans, right, or business continuity plans, they need to be defined within a policy so that we know how or what to do at any given particular point in time. And also we have roles and responsibilities that needs to be factored in so that we can always ensure that the policy is well followed or rather implemented. Otherwise, if it's just a document, then no one is going to see its importance, right? So, some of the benefits of having a network security, it gives the blueprint to a given company on how to implement the various security related issues, right? It also gives a step by step procedure in case there's some kind of breach within the network, right? It could be an incident, it could be a disaster, on how to handle such kind, right? And it also uh, gives us some clear understanding of the technologies that are used there. It could be the various applications, hardware, softwares, right? And of course, also it defines a responsibility. I have just mentioned about roles and responsibility of everyone, from how it is formulated, implemented, and rolled out, right? Ideally, it also acts as a legal framework in case of any, let's say, let's assume that someone has used, let's say, a particular a device that is not authorized to be used within a network, right? And in one way or the other, they end up creating some threat to our network. How are you going to make this particular person account for their actions? So it's by providing the policy and telling or stating the policy to this particular person that we don't allow such kind of devices to be used. So if they go ahead and use this particular device, in contrast with what, in contrary to what the policy states, then we can hand them to the authority, and that's where the legal cause of action is going to be implemented. So policies are very, very important because if you're a network admin who is actually practicing, or rather is given the mandate to secure the network, I think the only hope you have after everyone has left you alone is the policy, right? So as you implement your network security, document, 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 and have a well-structured policy. So you can have a password policy, for example, so that if someone or users or employees start saying that, you see, someone got into my computer, right? So they start laying blame on you. So what you can tell them is that the policy, the password policy, is that you need to have a strong password, right? Minimum, maximum, characters, alphanumeric, and all that. Another kind of policy that you can implement is the account management policies, right? So this one makes us understand the procedures of how users user accounts are created, right? How a particular user is given access to some kind of resources, right? Because ideally, it's very important to understand that we have people who come to the organization and they normally also leave the organization, right? So you need to know when to activate the accounts, when to terminate the accounts. Because if we have accounts that are not usable, you know the threat there. I think we mentioned it, right? Those particular accounts that are not used can always be hacked into or used by hackers, right? So you might think that this particular person is still available, only to realize that it is someone else who is using our resources. Apart from that, email policy, you also need to have some well-established rules for how company can use their emails, right? Normally, I say most organizations nowadays have their software. They use Gmail, right? Now, when you are, for example, employees are remotely accessing the company's resources, maybe they want to attach some files on their emails. What are the policies, right? Normally, you have to protect or guard how this particular communication happens outside the organization and within the organization. So nowadays, I think there's a device identity. There's a software that can always help you track on what kind of information is being sent via the organization email and so on. Just to have some policy so that if someone doesn't follow the policy of how to use the email, then they can be accountable, right? Then you have also another policy that can be implemented, the clean desk policy, right? So this is an environment where people or a threat can be implemented. Remember we said that when you have a threat and vulnerability, then an attack can be carried out. So we also need to ensure that the desks, the working spaces of employees actually are clean. Clean meaning that at least there's no one who can be able to peep and see maybe someone's screen, for example. And also, let's say, when you go to organizations, one thing you'll get are those stickers, people writing some or scribbling their password and placing them just close to so that wherever they go to work, they can read their password. Those are things that the clean desk policy should actually address, so that we protect organizations' data and even private information from leaking to the wrong users. Then we have another policies, that is the use of VPN, right? So I'm aware, like nowadays, most people remote or do what we call teleworking. Of course, teleworking also, telecommuting has its own policy. But ideally, for us to securely link to organizations' data, we need to have a virtual private network. So we need to ensure that everyone who is accessing our intranet maybe uses the established VPN, right, for data transfer, so that our confidential information again is not leaked, right, or someone doesn't get access to the vital information. Remember, we looked at some of the problems of network security breach, right? Like organization can lose its competition, or there's some kind of competitive advantage to other organizations in case they understand what is happening. All these can be captured within the VPN accepted use of policy. We also have the monitoring or auditing policies, right? Of course, this one actually is a policy based on the back end or how the network is actually implemented. Like, for example, if something happens, for instance, if you're not around, right, we have the intrusion detection systems, right? So it might help you understand what happened, right? So you can have some kind of alerts, right? So that just in case, right? So we can always, in case of auditing, we can always say that this is what happened and this is how it was resolved, right? And you can identify what are the actions that happened in a particular time. And when you are reviewing the system, we can use this particular policy, right, to eliminate those kind of issues. So these are the policies that I was talking about, right? Telecommuting policy, right? Because most people are actually nowadays working from home, right? So this is something, we have loopholes actually. And here is, this is what hackers like, when people constantly share information across the network, right? So if you're working for a health center or a hospital, they can always eavesdrop and pick confidential information, right? So we can always tie down some rules on how these particular telecommuting should actually work. Not everyone should be maybe given the rights to telecommute. So you also need to implement some training on how this telecommuting is going to happen, and who is responsible maybe for a particular resource, right, that they're using, the equipment, if it has been given to them, and so on. All that needs to be captured. And of course, you also have another policy that you can always implement, that is workstation configuration policy. Now, to really enhance security, we expect that the workstations, when you talk about the workstations, these are the computers that employees use. So it cuts across both on hardware and applications or softwares that are being used, right? So how are you going to deploy them? In fact, it starts from procurement. Yeah, who is going to get which kind of workstation, the specification of these particular workstations, and so on. Yeah, and even you should be able to tell us when are these workstations going to be maintained. In case of any breach of security, what should be done, right? Now, remember these policies, before you implement them, they need to be accompanied by some training. That's why one way of thwarting issues that emanate from security is to ensure that users are properly trained, so that when you tell them there's a policy, they know exactly what to do, right? We can also have a policy that states how vulnerability is going to be assessed. Remember, vulnerability are the weakest links in any given system, right? So we need to have some procedures, like if, for example, there's an attack on our database, right? We need to have a well clear structure of who is going to assess what happened and what counter actions need to be taken from the organization's point of view, right? So all this is required within the policy. And from the back end, as a network admin, again, you need to have the right server security policy. Ideally, one policy is who should be able to add, remove anything from the server, who should be able to access the server room, right? So I'll just give in some brief points here, but ideally there are a lot to be captured within these particular policies, right? Because if the server someone who is not authorized to operate the server gets access to this, remember they can always do a lot of damage to our network. We also have patch management policy. Periodically, we should be able to update our softwares, remember. So how are you going to do it? From which source or from which website are you going to do? Are you going to purchase the licenses exactly for this particular? What exactly? How are you going to manage these particular patches? Remember, patches are those particular enhanced softwares, or rather what we refer to as upgraded softwares, just to ensure that if there's some kind of weaknesses or loopholes, we can always remove them, right? So ideally, these particular patches are very important, right? And you can always have some set of procedures to help guide everyone within the organization on what to do, right? It should be used as a responsibility, actually. For example, if there's some kind of update that requires to be done, they can do it from the user end, or you can run the updates from the server end. Then we also have the use of personal devices, right, within the organization, or you realize that there are visitors who normally come to organization and they ask you, kindly help us with your Wi-Fi password. What are the policies that guides how people are going to use devices within our perimeters, right? So you should state clearly that here we only maybe allow the access of maybe Gmail alone. You can only send email alone within our network, or you create for them the guest accounts, right? So you need to have these kind of procedures, because even employees sometimes decide that they need to come with their own devices, right? So it's not only unauthorized users like visitors, even employees. So all these policies will help you, right? Now, I hope you understand the reason as to why we need a policy. It's always the fallback plan. If something goes or if something happens unexpectedly, right? You see, IT guys, you are the ones who will always be answerable to anything that happens within the organization in terms of maybe problems with the network security, system security, right? It is the policy that's going to help us. Of course, we have incident management policy, right? So I mentioned about the disaster recovery plan, incident management policies. Now, an incident, this is some set of actions that normally occur, and we often maybe just overlook them, right? Ideally, if you don't respond to an incident, be prepared to respond to a disaster. So the faster you respond to an incident, the better. Otherwise, it's going to escalate to become a disaster, and you'll find that you'll have to start from scratch again, right? So ideally, we need to have a well-defined policy on how people should report some given incidences, how they should handle some incidences before they really escalate to become a disaster. So those are some of the main policies that we can always talk about. So when you are structuring or coming up with a network policy, you should consider having those sub-policies within your main network security policy. Again, let's look at how, or the basic steps that you need to carry out when you're implementing a security policy. Number one, when you are structuring or coming up with a policy, try to be very specific on the assets that the organization have. When we talk about assets, we talk about tangible assets and intangible assets. Now, these tangible and intangible assets, we have some kind of a priority that we give to them. Like if you look at, for example, in an organization, there are those crucial applications or hardwares that handle a very sensitive or important organization data, right? We need to identify them and give them priority so that even if it's a backup procedure that we are implementing, we start with those sensitive assets. So the policy needs to capture that very, very well. And of course, step 2, do a threat assessment. Threat assessments cannot be done in-house. Of course, you can escalate these to other third parties, maybe to check whether there's some kind of loopholes or flaws or gaps within your network, right? So you can look for other third-party people. It could be people, it could be an organization, to test your softwares, to test your network and hardware, right? So that in case of anything, you can always be rest assured that at least you have identified some major vulnerabilities or weakness within that particular system. So what happens once you have identified that? So you need to do some post-threat assessment action plan. So these are what actions are you going to do to ensure that you eliminate those problems that you have already detected. So you can apply some prevention plans, right, that will help you maybe get rid of this form of issues or attacks, should there be, right? For instance, as you can see, you may have to update an existing application or purchase equipment that you find that is not meeting the right requirements. So after you have done, those are kind of just analysis. After you've done, now you can start now reinforcing these within the policy and procedures. So you have to now go back to the 4 policies that we have mentioned, right, and incorporate them one by one, right? Ensure that when you are crafting these particular policies, involve the necessary management levels within the organization so that also they understand what happens. Now, this is the catch when implementing a policy. You have to carefully define the incident response. Now we talk about, of course, roles and responsibilities. Which team? I happen to have gone to organization and they have very clear communication plan or guidelines so that if something happens, maybe someone escalate this one to another person. So there's some kind of stages or roles, right? So that one can be captured in an incident response, especially for a response to happen effectively. Communication is very, very important. So you need to have a very clear way of how people are going to give you the information about these incidences that occur. So a good way is to structure a good incident response plan, right? You give people roles and responsibility. Also, you need to have security controls. We talk about security mechanisms or how to implement security controls. You can have things such as firewalls, ensuring that you have upgraded softwares, just any control, security control that you can use, even password strategies that you have mentioned. You need to implement them, right? So I've looked at some I've done some research and I've realized that to help implement a good network policy, you need to follow this National Institute of Standards and Technology cyber security framework, right? Is actually going to help you tackle or understand how you can go about implementing a proper network security policy. And this is the framework from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. First of all, take note of the assets. We have so far mentioned about this, isn't it? So identify what the organization has. If, for example, we have the natural threat, such as, let's say, flooding or fire, for example, right? And we have a lab that has been engulfed by fire. Can we account for the number of computers that were there, the specifications? So you need to take inventory, identify. Secondly, protect, right? So have the right protective measures are put in place just to get prepared in case of an incident. And then third, have the right detection tools or procedures or measures, right? We've talked about the intrusion detection systems. You can have them, right? Just to give you some information on what is happening. And of course, response. I say that we have incident and we have disasters. So if you don't respond quickly to an incident, then chances are you'll be looking forward to respond to a disaster. And when disaster happen, now you'll have an issue, right? Because disaster simply means the whole network is down, right? So an incident is where maybe 1, 2, 3 computers are not properly configured, or rather we have one section of network that has issues. But a disaster, you need now to start all over again, and it could be costly for the organization, right? But let's say the disaster has happened, you need to have the right business continuity plan, right? And business continuity plan here will be based on the procedures that you took forehand, like proper backup, right? These are not the things that you really need to be told, right? Because it's one way to ensure that the organization takes off in case of incident, right? So you can always bring the backup. These are very nice recovery procedures. Now, building a security policy, we need to identify the various key components of how we can tie it down, whatever you have just mentioned. So a good security policy first is to understand the benefit, and you've already looked at that. It communicates vision for the entire company, represents a single use, right? So everyone can always locate to that policy. There's no any other third party to make excuses, right? And of course, it's a flexible document in that you can always change it when something happens. We can't just use one policy for over 3 years. A security policy is a policy that keeps on changing. If there's some kind of intrusion that has been identified, we can always update that, right? If the network has changed, we can always update that on our policy. So it should cover the following. A good policy should have a purpose, a scope. It should communicate the purpose. The scope actually covers the organization as a whole, right? And who is responsible. We have looked at that, right? And penalties for non-compliance. If someone is not following the policy, what should they be given, or rather how should they be punished? Physical security, we also need to have that captured within the policy. And of course, you have seen also the user identification management. You also need to capture that. You also now need to capture the overall network security. And of course, you need to capture the system security, right? Better still, we need to keep on testing our network to ensure that the vulnerabilities are identified and the loopholes are well sealed, so that when you audit it, we can always improve on the already implemented network. So ideally, that is a very key document, the policy, that's going to aid us in how we can be able to secure our network.